weakness being the loss of self in terms of maybe caregiving, but with respect to the idea of heroism, that loss of self actually isn't a weakness. It's exactly the fact that I have sacrificed, the hero has sacrificed so much of him or herself that empowers the hero to become this larger-than-life figure, right? So when I put weakness, I'm going to put it in actual scare quotes, right? One of the weaknesses might be a sacrifice and loss of self. Sacrifice, loss of self. But I gave you an example in using an ethics of care under a qualitative methods model, how that can be empowering, right? How you can empower and it's not your responsibility to empower the participant. I'm not saying that during the interview, absolutely not. You should just sort of be taking notes and asking questions. In your field work, after it's been concluded and you've concluded your coding, it's at that point that you might come to the recognition, or not, that it was precisely I would make this assumption to begin my research. I would have to actually conduct the research to validate the findings, but it's exactly in the loss of self, in the act of sacrifice of self, that one becomes powerful. And obviously this is years and years of research, and I know quite a bit of Nietzsche, to know that there is already some conceptual theoretical justification for this. And I don't mean sacrifice in terms of, giving my life for the cause. More so giving my identity, relinquishing things that I could otherwise be doing for a recognition that my actions are for, future generations, for the greater good, for what have you, for my religious beliefs, for my state, for my country, for whatever it might be. Okay, next, with respect to ethics of care again, and remember weakness, a failure to recognize the autonomy of the other. The idea, to go back to the example of a husband or a wife assuming the role, or having to assume the role of caregiver, is a potential failure is that I fail to recognize the autonomy of the other, specifically because the other has lost autonomy, right? If we're talking about acts of caregiving, to be really sort of specific, there's a sense in which there is a loss of autonomy. Tons of qualitative research out there about the effects that Alzheimer's has on familial members. Great question to ask. Great topics of research for qualitative methods analysis, right? There is a sense in which the very nature of the research is contingent on the loss of autonomy of a member of the family, which creates the obligation to give care to that individual, right? So the recognition is that there is there's a complex sort of interweaving of dependencies in these modes of research. And with respect to the ethical considerations, what we have to engage, I'm not saying you have to, what you should do is engaging the participants is to recognize the interwoven dependencies, right? It is the fact that the obvious, the individual receiving care is dependent on the family, but there is a sense in which the family is dependent on that individual precisely because the family has selected to give care. Right? You give care because there's a sense of love, there's a sense of community, there's a sense of what have you, and what we want to recognize is, and are, the motivations that lead individuals to accept that responsibility, right? So, for example, it would be awesome if Superman were a real person, to ask him, Superman, dude, like, why would you care about, us, as one level of questioning, but a deeper level of questioning for Superman is, Superman, since we know that you care based on your actions, what's motivating that care, right? What motivates you to care, right? It's one thing to say, and this is a much more nuanced point, and it's difficult to demarcate the question, but it's one thing to ask a person why they are doing what they're doing. It's another thing to ask them what's motivating that act, right? So, Dr. Campbell, why are you doing all of these lectures for free? Okay, because I want to make the world a better place, right? That's the sort of cliched response. What's motivating this act? Well, I'm not going to tell you what's motivating this act, right? It's two different things, right? Why I'm doing it and what's motivating it are two different things. In an ethics of care, and not to say that you can't do this in the justice-based model, but in ethics of care, it's precisely that nuanced distinction that you want to get at, right? Right? What about your care for this thing, for your state, for your family, for your religion, is motivating your action? Because tons of other people have the same care, but don't act in the way that you act. And in a good sense, it's heroism. In a bad sense, it's villainy. So, I mean, you have sort of the demarcation, right? So, one of the weaknesses might be a failure to recognize the other, as I said, because of the inherent nature of the dilemma, what in whatever way it might manifest, failure to and then lastly, over-identification with the other, right? My critique of Superman is that Superman, personally, and this is horrible to say, my critique with Superman is that Superman cares too much. I like Batman better than Superman. Batman's like, yeah, I got a lot of tools, I got a lot of gadgets, I don't have superpowers, and I'm going to care to an extent. But then he becomes the Dark Knight, and he doesn't, I can't fight the world's battles, right? And over-identification with the other is arguably, I'm not saying that it is, but it's arguably a weakness in the care model, right? You can have someone, arguably, I don't know that people would do this research, but, sort of the burden, literally, the burden of caring, right? And I know I'm going to catch flack for saying that, but there is a sense in which it is an extremely exhaustive process. It's an exhaustive process. It's a huge burden. Some people won't say it's a burden who are classified as heroes. Mother Teresa, would you say that it's a burden? No, it's my lifelong obligation. Someone who performs exactly the same acts as she does in spreading literacy, in feeding people, in doing missionary work, might perceive their role as a burden. Me, doing these videos, might in confidence tell someone that this is an extremely exhaustive process, but there's a mania about my personality that is addicted to this process, specifically because it's a burden in some masochistic sense, right? So I probably put a little too much out there, but there is a sense in which there is an over-saturation and overindulgence in the other, right? As I didn't write it down, but I'll write it down. Over-identification with the other, right? Over-ID with other. There's a sense in which I'm overly invested in you to my own detriment. I don't believe this. I think because I curtail it and I veg out, I play games, I get stupid. I don't really care that you don't care about your education if you don't. But there's a sense in which one of the weaknesses might be an over-identification with the other. What's motivating this care? Well, it's an over-identification with the other because I used to be like you, and I wanted to be like I am now, and I did it, and no one helped me. I did it roughly by myself, which is false. I mean, community and family helped, but I've methodically created a system of self-improvement, so I know that it works. So here it is on display. Why don't you do it? That can become a very exhaustive process because you put it out there and people will see it and say, I don't want to better myself. You got to come to terms with that, right? There might be a sense in which, and I think this makes for the best qualitative research, I think this makes for the best research questions and the best interview questions and the best theoretical approaches. I love this type of research where an individual will be motivated by care, but the very community that the individual is motivated to care for doesn't want their assistance, right? I think a contemporary account, for example, to really get deep now so you can see applications, a contemporary account of white man's burden would be phenomenal. I would love to read that. I would love to read that, right? Why? Because we're post-colonial, or maybe even post-colonial, right? So colonial mentality is there. We understand what the colonizer has done, and we recognize what the atrocities have been insofar as colonial mind state homogenizes across a group that have been othered by this colonial mentality. But the question is, and this is provocative, especially coming from a black dude, right? I know that this is provocative. I can't even believe I'm putting it out there, but I mean, is there some legitimacy to the claim that, hey,